Let's move on to item 10F. Receive a report and adopt a resolution approving the City of San Bruno Reserves Policy.
Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council, the proposed reserve policy is before you this evening in response to previous discussions that occurred during the development of the 2012-13 budget, in which we began discussions on the creation of a reserve policy. I would like to be clear that from the start that this is what I'm viewing as a starting point for the creation of a reserve policy. I'm viewing this as a step-by-step process, and tonight, the discussion tonight is really what I would view a first step and focuses primarily on the establishment of general fund reserve funds. What I'd like to do is walk through the proposed policy and hear your thoughts and receive some direction on this policy. Adoption of the resolution this evening is not necessary. We can come back at a later date if the council desires, or we can move forward tonight with a first step, knowing that we will come back and continue to add and revise this policy over time as we collect more information. So what I'd like to do is start by going into what are the current reserve funds that we have. Just because we don't have a reserve policy doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have reserve funds. At this point in time, we have two separate funds that are undesignated general fund reserve funds. Those are the general fund reserve and the one-time revenue reserve. Both of these funds have been funded over time as a result of one-time monies we've received, as well as any type of budget surplus that might have occurred in years past would also be absorbed into a general fund reserve. And so neither of the two funds have a dedicated ongoing funding source. They have been funded over time through one-time monies. The latter two items, the self-insurance fund and the equipment reserve fund, are both internal service reserve funds that are currently funded through the operating budget. Each year, we look at what the need is in each of those departments, and we fund based on an allocation from departments. So those are reserve funds that are in place. The proposed policy that is before you this evening does not include a discussion on the self-insurance fund or the equipment reserve fund, only because those funds are currently established. They currently have a funding source, and what we'd like to do is do further research and get more information before we come back and have another discussion on what the appropriate fund balance levels might be of those funds. So to start, why do we have a reserve policy? What's the point of establishing one? It's really a financial management best practice. It allows an agency to be prepared to deal with uncertainty and the unexpected. Financial reserves demonstrate the financial stability and strength of an organization. They allow an agency to maintain good standing with credit rating agencies, and we actually saw this firsthand recently. In early December, we did a credit rating presentation for the issuance of the pension obligation bonds with Standard & Poor's, and one thing that we discussed quite a bit and that they looked at were our current reserve balances. They wanted those assurances that the city could deal with an unexpected event. So strength in financial reserves, I feel, was a major factor in us being able to secure a AA rating. In addition, they allow an agency to generate interest income, although these days it's not very much. And they ensure that resources are available during emergency situations. So to begin on the development of a reserve policy, typically you begin developing a reserve policy with the general fund reserve. It's the most visible reserve, and it's the one that is looked to most often. That said, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and really it's a matter of walking through and analyzing some of the different factors and making a determination of what works for an agency. General fund reserves are typically set up as, they're typically established as a percentage of overall general fund expenditures. That's what you will see in most agencies. The GFOA recommends that an agency have a minimum of 2 months, 16.6% of general fund reserves set aside. That said, it can range from anywhere from that 15% level to as high as 40, 50% and above. So what do you look at in beginning to determine what is the appropriate level? You would first start by looking at the risk factors. The risk of disaster is the first item that I'd like to discuss. And the city of San Bruno sits on the San Andreas Fault, and therefore the risk of earthquake is fairly significant. So as we have learned through one of the takeaways from what occurred with the Glenview pipeline disaster is the financial repercussions and the financial implications of a disaster are significant. Just the mutual aid costs to begin with for those first few weeks in response to the Glenview fire were in excess of $6 million. In a situation in which there isn't 100% recovery or reimbursement, the agency could be liable for up to 25% of those costs. So those are some things to keep in mind. The next item to think about is revenue volatility. San Bruno is fortunate to have a stable and diverse revenue base. We currently have our highest single revenue source is sales tax at just about 20%. So we are well diversified. However, that said, any major retailer leaving the city would have a major impact on the budget. So nobody's immune from revenue volatility. However, we do have a somewhat stable base, so it's something to keep in mind. The next item is to evaluate the potential for loss. What is the potential for current liability claims outstanding, and is there any potential liability for us, and are we covered for those situations? The self-insurance fund that I mentioned earlier currently has a balance of $2.1 million. That's a cash balance of $2.1 million. And that amount is actually sufficient to cover the calculated liability of our claims at this point in time. So while we can't say that it is the right level with certainty, we do know at this point in time that it is sufficient to cover our unfunded liabilities related to claims. Additional considerations include the size of the city. You tend to see smaller cities having larger reserves because they may be more dependent on just one or two revenue streams. Budget practices. If a city's approach to budgeting is to include contingencies or a lot of one-time monies, makes them susceptible to economic changes. However, the city's approach has been a very conservative approach to budgeting. And finally, looking at debt levels. We have a very, very low debt levels. We have very minimal debt, especially general fund debt. So therefore, there's no necessity from a debt perspective of maintaining a high reserve. So these are all of the factors that should be evaluated when determining the appropriate reserve level. Beyond determining the reserve level, some thought needs to be given to the guidelines for the use of reserve funds. Typically, you want to find the appropriate balance between language that provides flexibility for those unanticipated situations, but also ensures that the reserves will be there during the times they're intended for. What we attempted to do with this policy is address this by establishing two separate general fund reserve funds. The first is a general fund reserve that proposes a goal of maintaining a target fund balance of 25% of general fund operating expenditures, which would equate at this point in time to about $8.1 million, with an initial deposit right now of 20% or $6.5 million. The guidelines for the use of the general fund reserve in the proposed policy would be in situations in which there is a decrease in revenues in excess of 5% of total expenditures, in total revenues in 1 year. Now keep in mind 5% equates to $1.5 million, so that is a very significant amount, and so that's something to keep in mind of whether or not that's a reasonable number or if something smaller or larger may be of more comfort. The next would be in a situation in which there's a loss of revenues from another government entity, and the first thing that comes to mind here is another situation similar to redevelopment in which we have a devastating loss of revenue to the city. this policy would allow the general fund reserve to be utilized in those types of situations. Finally, it also allows the flexibility to utilize the general fund reserve for one-time, non-recurring initiatives of the City Council that are important. So it allows that flexibility to fund one-time projects that may have no other funding source. Second fund that we are proposing to be established would be what was called a general fund contingency reserve, and this would have a goal of maintaining a target fund balance of $1.5 million. And this fund would have no restrictions on its use. It would be flexible and allow the City Council to utilize that fund in the event that it needs to be used to balance a budget, any type of situation that seems appropriate. So this would provide that flexibility. I just wanted to give you a little bit of perspective of what some of the general fund reserve policies, the ranges are in other cities in San Mateo County. And you can see they vary pretty widely. Belmont at 20%, Brisbane at $6 million, although I don't have a percentage of their budget there, but they are a smaller agency, and I would expect them to have a far higher percentage of their expenditures reserved for. Menlo Park, well above average with the 43 to 55% range. And then the rest of the cities tend to be in that 10, 15, 20% range that we've talked about. So this just gives you some perspective of where other cities are in the county. So moving on from the discussion on the general fund reserve funds, the proposed policy includes some discussion on the development of additional reserve funds. The first of those would be the creation of an emergency disaster reserve fund with a initial goal of $3 million funding target balance. And this fund would be reserved only for those situations in which a declaration of emergency were declared, and then those funds would be the go-to source of funds for that situation. The next fund would be the establishment of a capital improvement one-time initiatives fund. We currently do not have a dedicated funding source or fund for general capital improvement projects, similar to the archway earlier. Any types of improvements to city facilities, whether they be maintenance, painting projects, so on, also any type of capital improvements to city parks, currently have no dedicated funding source. And so as a first step towards addressing those needs, the policy recommends establishing a capital improvement one-time initiatives fund with a target balance of $5 million. Beyond those two funds, it also addresses the policy to have a 25% reserve in our internal service operating funds, and that includes the central garage, building and facilities fund, and technology. And why these funds are included this evening is really because these are also critical departments that need to be able to continue operating in an emergency situation. So therefore, it would be appropriate to have a 25%, minimum 25% reserve balance in those funds. Beyond the establishment of the reserves, the policy goes into some discussion about strategies to grow the reserve funds. The idea is to allow flexibility in the language, which states at this point in time the receipt of one-time and unbudgeted revenues during the course of the year, along with any surplus that might remain in the general fund at year-end, would be added to the reserve funds in a certain order. So it would start with the general fund reserve, and if that is fully funded, move on to the general fund contingency fund. Once that is fully funded, move on to the emergency disaster fund, and so on, until we've met those obligations, those target goal balances in those funds. But the language is flexible in that it's unbudgeted funds. So this isn't to say that the establishment of a reserve policy would limit the City Council's ability to utilize certain one-time revenues to balance the budget if appropriate. It's just simply going beyond that. If it's not included in the budget, the thought would be to put it in one of the reserve funds. So that all said, I wanted to summarize what it would look like if the proposed policy that is before you this evening were to be implemented. So where we would end up is with a general fund reserve at 20% of general fund expenditures, or $6.5 million. We would have a general fund contingency fund of $1.5 million. We would have an emergency disaster reserve fund of $3 million. We would have a capital improvement one-time initiatives fund of $5 million. And we would have reserve funds in the internal service funds, central garage, building and facilities, and technology at 25%. And then also I just wanted to highlight, even though they're not specifically part of the discussion tonight because they are reserve funds that already exist, we would continue to have the self-insurance fund at $2.1 million and the equipment reserve fund, which currently has a fund balance of $6.3 million, although I would just bring to your attention of that $6.3 million, $2.9 million of that is in the form of a receivable from the former redevelopment agency. You might recall that the loan that was made from the city to the redevelopment agency to fund the initial startup costs many years ago was from the equipment reserve fund. And so the outstanding amount of $2.9 million is from the equipment reserve fund. We do believe that money will be repaid over time. However, one caveat to that is 20% of it will have to go towards low and moderate income housing initiatives per the legislation. So we will not see the entire 2.9 back in there, but that's for another discussion. So that just summarizes where we would be at the end of the day with this policy. So with that, I'd like to hand it over for discussion and be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of Kim?
Just, if I could.
Ken?
In the staff report, Kim, there was a brief discussion about questioning the self-insurance fund, whether that was at a level that staff felt was appropriate, or is that something we should also consider?
Yes, I would say that the fund at this point in time, I'm comfortable and I think it's sufficient for now at the balance because it is sufficient to cover what is our calculated liability. However, it would make sense and for us to look at that further and see if that reserve is sufficient, if we need to consider reserving for any additional potential losses. And that would be, the plan would be to come back and discuss that further in addition to the equipment replacement fund at some point in time.
Rico? No question? Good. Michael? Irene?
No, I've seen this a few times, but
Yeah.
I did have one question about the Building and Facility Reserve Fund. The buildings and facilities that are addressed in that fund are what we would consider general fund facilities, not enterprise facilities. And the enterprise facilities would be funded by an enterprise fund? Is that correct?
Well, the Building and Facilities Fund, it does include an allocation from some of the enterprise funds. And what this Building and Facilities Reserve Fund, I want to be clear that this is really the operating fund for the ongoing maintenance of city facilities. It is not a replacement. It isn't currently set up to serve as a replacement fund for the facilities, but rather to ensure that they can be maintained on an ongoing basis. And so, because it's an operating department and it does serve all the enterprise funds as well, it is partially funded through enterprise funds.
But would the maintenance of all of our facilities be covered in that?
Yes, at this time, the way it's structured, yes.
The way it's structured. Okay, thank you.
Ken?
So, for example, I think it's a lot clearer if you give an example of what we would use it for. If we didn't have funding to paint City Hall, would that be the first reserve fund? And if we had the Building and Facilities Reserve Fund, would that be the first fund we may consider?
So the Building and Facilities Fund does not have any restrictions on it at this time. It's funded through an internal allocation from all the user departments. And so that includes not only general fund departments, but it includes the enterprise fund departments. But the money that is sitting in the Building and Facilities Fund can be utilized for projects such as the painting projects. There's no restrictions on those funds.
Let me see if I could address what it might be a little bit of confusion here. The Building and Facilities Fund is an operating fund, and it is the allocations from the various departments, including the enterprise funds, are made in an amount which is intended to cover basic operating costs. And that would include pretty minor types of normal repair and maintenance of those buildings. It would not, for example, include what might be considered a more major type of repair or maintenance project, such as a roof replacement, such as exterior building painting of, say, City Hall, one of our larger buildings. Nothing of a significant dollar amount is intended to be funded through the Building and Facilities Operating Fund. So I think to answer your question, Councilmember Salazar, more precisely, a major repair or replacement or maintenance project at an enterprise facility, a well, for example, would be funded by enterprise funds through the capital budget. A similar major repair, a roof replacement at a fire station, a painting of the exterior of City Hall, some other more significant dollar value, a capital repair, maintenance, or replacement cost for a general fund, a non-enterprise facility, City Hall, the rec center, parks, those types of things would not be, has no dedicated funding source. And it would be the general intent of this policy to fund or to have funds, a limited amount of funds, available through the capital reserve in order to be able to at least have some money available to go to for those types of issues. I hope that helps.
Okay, yeah, it definitely helps, and the amount just seemed low to me. And even if it only covers minor things, I think as the plant ages, I'm sure that the yearly expenses of keeping things running is actually going to increase, I would imagine, just because you have to fix more things start falling apart.
You're talking about the Building and Facilities Fund.
Still.
So, for example, if there's a repair needed to a sink or a tile comes off of the wall in the restroom, those types of really pretty simple and inexpensive repairs are generally captured in day-to-day activities funded by the Building and Facilities Reserve, or the Building and Facilities Fund. Where the city's main, I would say, exposure to cost, it really comes at those bigger ticket items for our major facility, this building, for example, the many city facilities that we rely on an everyday basis for normal activities, should they need, and they will need at some point, all of them, major repairs and replacement. That's what the capital reserve is intended to begin to address. But even at $5 million or $8 million, we're a long, long ways from having funds available to do what, over the life cycle of those buildings, will need to be done.
Okay. And just another clarification, all of the fund balances that are proposed here, they currently exist. We currently have those balances. So, thank you.
Okay, Rico?
Through the chair. This is one thing that is some good news, and I think it's a policy we need to establish. I also know that this is something that we can modify and change over time. This is just embarking upon some foundation, some groundwork. I would, I know when I came in, God, it's not just yesterday anymore, but in 06, we had maybe about a little under 5.9 million in reserves. Now that's double. Nothing to be sorry for. I think that's sound responsibility, planning for unforeseen circumstances. And I always remember, if we had a Madison mudslide or a Claremont, it doesn't take much to deplete $5-point-something million. And as we learned with a disaster, as you indicated, if we were responsible for 25%, what that would have cost. So I think we need to be extremely mindful. I'm still always on the view of being more conservative with this. It's always better to have and worry about having too much than not having enough. I believe that we should bring this back up at the budget study session to review this document, see where we're at today, where we're at then, and where we should be going forward so we can review it. and I know you're looking forward to budget. It's just around the corner. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Good. Okay. Ken?
With all that said, I think I agree. It's great to have the nest egg. The thing is that we really don't know, the status of a lot of our facilities. We don't know what things we may have to anticipate. I think that's something that we, not necessarily nuts and bolts, but I think we need to hear from, have some sort of updated report as to where we are in certain things. And I was speaking to the manager earlier, and I know we bought some time on the pool. We resurfaced the swimming pool, and so that's something that we may not have to, use so much funds in repairing. But roofs, roofs are always deteriorating, and it's not cheap because we have some large facilities, and it's just the sheer volume. So I think if we have an idea of where we are in the life of some of our facilities, then we can sort of gauge or establish our priorities on something like a capital improvement, one-time fund. So I think that's also has to be part of the dialogue in establishing these funds.
Okay. Anyone else?
Through the chair.
Irene?
Thank you. I agree. I think it's very prudent what we're doing. I'm encouraged that you've put so much thought, the staff has put so much thought into what you've done here. I would like us to also hold off and re-examine this during the budget time. I think one of the things I'd like to see is some mechanism or some thought given to how to allocate for just the things that the rest of the council has been speaking of. So this building is going to need a new roof. It's probably going to cost generally, $200,000, say. So and say it's going to be in 10 years. So should this facility put aside X amount of money, above and beyond what we're doing, some way to allocate from each facility to fund the things that are going to happen. I know way back when we used to just have a general fund reserve, and that took care of everything, and it got kind of dicey about who got what and how much went where, and then we started allocating costs from each department to replenish different replenish the equipment reserve fund was one, and to just allocate, like, to the city attorney's time to reallocate back the cost of his time for each different department. So there might be some way to look at how to fund these separate reserve funds in that manner, instead of just kind of waiting for one-time money and allocating it out that way. So I'd like us to try to develop some suggestions for that during the budget time.
Good.
Years ago, we had created a fund for an archway.
That's right. Very true.
Actually, we'll see that. Just on that comment, that's we had no Culture and Arts Commission, and we had no Culture and Arts Commission money until we established that and established how to fund it, which was totally separate from the general funds. So that was, I think, some good thought went into doing that, and I think it was a very positive thing, and pretty painless to the residents of San Bruno. So I think we can keep on doing that, just like the technology fund that was added to the costs for the different permits and the printing out of whatever we were doing and stuff. So anyway, I think it's a direction to take.
Yeah, I was the second member on the committee with Councilmember Salazar, and this is definitely some good stuff going forward. It's always good to know what you have, especially if you don't know what's coming after. So this is good. It's great. And a lot of work went into this with Kim and her staff too, so I appreciate that once again. So we have received a report, and they're asking for a resolution to be adopted this evening, with the understanding, of course, that we're going to fine-tune it as we go forward.
We'll go ahead and move to introduce the resolution. please.
You mumbled.
I'm sorry.
Councilmember Medina.
Aye.
Councilmember Ibera.
Aye.
Councilmember Salazar.
Aye.
Vice Mayor O'Connell.
Aye.
Mayor Ruane.
Aye.
I'll be more clear next time, usually.